What's a sponsor? In Alcoholics Anonymous, you'll hear that word being used. And we're not talking about Audible or Squarespace or Skillshare. It's a little bit more serious than that. And do you need a sponsor to get sober? And how do you find a sponsor? What does a sponsor do? I'm going to talk about that in this video. Hi, I'm Cams. I'm an alcoholic. I'm sober today and I plan on keeping that sobriety by giving some of it to you. I first got to Alcoholics Anonymous in 2000 and it didn't stick. Did I have a sponsor then? No, I did not. When I got back to the rooms in 2005, this time it did stick. I was on my knees and I would have done anything that was suggested to me as a means of finding sobriety. The stakes were high. I was on the verge of losing everything. My wife had actually already left with my 18-month-old daughter. Oh, and she was pregnant. On the day that she left, I picked up the phone book and I found the number for Alcoholics Anonymous and dialed. I got through to a lovely Irish lady who told me when the meetings were and where, and said that she would be there to meet me when I got there. That single act persuaded my wife to give me one more last chance. So I attended as many meetings as I could, which at that time was 3. There were 3 English-speaking meetings in Luxembourg city centre. And I made all 3 of those as many weeks as I could. And what was different about this time than the first time around? Well, I was there for me. That's the main thing. The first time I went was as a suggestion from my wife. At the time she wasn't my wife, she was my girlfriend. And she got to see firsthand what my drinking was like when she came to visit me in Kazakhstan, where I was working at the time. And that frightened her, and that was when she suggested that I seek help. And so that's what I did. But I wasn't ready, and that's the difference. In 2005, I was ready. I was beat. And so I got to the meetings on my knees and was ready to do anything that was suggested. And the longer I sat in meetings, the more I got to hear other people sharing their experience, strength and hope. And the more that helped me to come to understand that there was no way I was going to find and keep sobriety on my own. So I knew I was in the right place. And the third thing that was different, I got a sponsor. A sponsor, yes. This is a word that you will find in meetings and in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think that it's actually a bit of a misleading word, particularly in the current commercial climate that we now find ourselves, when sponsorship tends to trigger the idea in people's minds of money. I think back to my BMX days. I remember that getting sponsorship was a huge deal for a BMX freestyle rider, to get to wear a Skyway logo on their shirt and get paid to go and do contests, etc. But sponsor is the word that's used in the big book, and I've learned over time that it's best not to mess with the big book. However, what I would say is that going into this, if you were to think of it perhaps more as a guide or a mentor, those are words I think that work better in the mental health arena. So that's how I tend to think of it, although I will continue to use the word sponsor because I'm not going to go messing with the big book. I've learned from other people who do that thinking that you know better usually leads to a fall. So when I got to the rooms, I was in there for a couple of months, I think it was, before I found a sponsor, before I worked up the courage to ask someone. And how did I decide on whom to ask? Well, I basically picked a guy that I could imagine having a few pints with. That's the long and short of it. It was somebody whose shares I could identify with and whose sobriety I found helpful. So I asked, and thankfully he agreed. And that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship that continues to this day. And we're talking 2005, and at the time of recording this, it's 2021. So it has been a very valuable relationship for me. And although we don't talk anywhere like as often as we used to, we do still talk. And I had the great pleasure of meeting him again last year when I went to visit Luxembourg. And I hadn't seen him since I left in 2008. So it was wonderful to see him again. And it felt like putting on an old pair of slippers, you know. It was incredible. A sponsor is somebody that will sit with you on a one-to-one basis and help you through the steps of AA. That's really the long and short of it. It's generally recommended that a sponsor should be someone of the same gender as you, but I would expand on that and say that if you are attracted to the same gender, then perhaps look for somebody of the opposite gender. The reason for that is that when you start to form a relationship, particularly as a newcomer, you're going to feel vulnerable and exposed. And that can lead to certain feelings growing within you. And you could be seeking attachment for all sorts of reasons. So if you begin to form feelings for your sponsor, it can really get in the way of your sobriety. And rejection can hurt. If that comes about, that can lead to picking up a drink. And the whole idea of sponsorship is to help you to find sobriety and keep it. So anything that you can do to prevent that from happening right from the word go is recommended. So that's why it's recommended that you choose somebody that there's no danger of you beginning to form feelings for. The age doesn't matter. All it needs to be is somebody who has a decent length of sobriety and who has gone through the steps themselves. It doesn't need to be somebody who has sponsored before. It just needs to be somebody whose sobriety and recovery and shares you feel some identification with. Someone that you could imagine spending extended periods of time with. And a sponsor should be somebody who's willing to pick up the phone whenever you make a call, whenever you feel the need to connect for whatever reason. If you're running through some fear in your brain, if you're facing a situation that you can't handle, particularly if you're feeling like picking up a drink, pick up the phone. Call your sponsor. Sponsors are people, just like you, and they're not superhuman. They're vulnerable. Sobriety is important to them as well. So if you're not taking it seriously, then don't expect your sponsor to be there to pick up the pieces. Everyone expects to have a slip now and again, that's perfectly normal. But don't go calling your sponsor drunk every day, because that just isn't going to wash. Well, there's a paradox in AA that goes something along the lines of you get to keep your sobriety by giving it away. And that means really that if you're struggling, if life is getting in the way, this is from a sponsor's point of view, it can really help to get out of your own head by helping somebody else. And this doesn't just apply to helping other alcoholics. This applies to family, to friends, whatever it might be. Being kind and helpful really helps the alcoholic to keep sobriety, especially when it comes to helping other alcoholics. Because what that's going to do is it's going to put recovery in the sponsor's mind, first and foremost. And believe it or not, that's not the case every minute of the day. Kind of like I'm doing here, making these videos. It's helping me to stay sober by helping you, because here I am sitting talking about my sobriety and my recovery. It's top of mind, and it's helping me to lead the kind of life that I wish to lead, which is a sober life. So sponsorship is not something to be taken lightly, but it is something that will help the sponsor in their own sobriety by helping you to find your sobriety. And the longer that relationship continues, the better it is for both parties. So it's a win-win, really. That's a tricky one. The steps are suggested as a programme of recovery. And I know that they work because I've been through them. I did go through them with a sponsor. Not everybody does that. It's possible to go through the steps without sponsorship, simply by listening in meetings and by sharing your journey as you're going through it. But I found that meetings were not enough. I really needed to have that one-to-one contact with somebody whose sobriety was stronger than mine. I know that it is possible to get sober without doing the steps. I've seen it. I know that there are people who are sober without having done the steps, but who are suffering in life for all sorts of reasons. Now, I know that the big book gives you the programme of recovery. I also am aware that it was written in 1939, or it was published, rather, in 1939, and the language is archaic, perhaps a little bit out of touch with the modern world. So, I would suggest, if you really didn't want to go through the steps as they're laid out in the big book, I mean, this is called Trying to Find an Easier, Softer Way. And with all the earnestness at my command, I would beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. So that's an example of the words from the big book in the chapter 5, which is entitled How It Works. But those words could, or rather the sentiment of those words could work without actually sticking to those words, if that makes sense. So I could say something like, if you can find a way of living a more spiritual life, if you can learn to be kind to yourself and to others, that's perhaps a simpler way of putting it. I could say that when you decide to get sober, you need to take it seriously, right from the beginning. And if you half-ass it, you're going to fail. So that's, again, a reiteration of some of the words from the big book, but put in different words. So if you're really against the idea of doing the steps, what I would propose for you would be to find a sponsor who's able to take you through the programme, but without actually using the terminology from the book. Because I think the path to sobriety is the same for all of us. The words that you use are less important. But if you were asking me to sponsor you, I would suggest quite strongly that you do the steps. And if you were against the idea, I would probably suggest that you find a different sponsor. I'm not saying that doing the steps is the only way to get sober, but that's how I did it, and so I would feel that that was the best way for me to share my experience, strength and hope with you by talking about my own experience. I hope that you've got some value from watching this video. If you're interested in learning about the steps in 12 short videos, check out this playlist that I made. This goes through the 12 steps in under 60 seconds for each step. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you get to find and keep your sobriety. And remember, you're not alone.